Hello and welcome to Plus One to Gaming. I am Eric.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to episode 2 of our ongoing series on character creation. How to choose a race that is right for your character.
There are dozens of races and creatures and even monsters to play as. So yeah, it can be a little overwhelming with all of the history and stat blocks and sub-races and lore.
Today we're going to focus on how to pick a race for your character. Some different approaches you can take, things to consider, and how we choose to play different races.
Let's get into it. Yeah, so choosing a race is either something that's really important and pivotal for your character, or it's just, simply a footnote.
I know that some of the races that I've chosen, I typically really like to play humans. It's very secondary for me a lot of times, the race. It's not really that important to the personality of the character.
Yeah, and some of this stuff can also happen simultaneously. You're filling out your race, you're figuring out your name, you're figuring out kind of all these things in conjunction with each other. So, Eric, you talked a lot about names in the first episode. Race can also be used to inform or help your naming.
Yeah, in the player's handbook specifically, every different race option on every page has some like different names that are typical elven names, typical dwarvish names, things like that. For me, in my naming style, that doesn't necessarily have to go hand in hand. But I know that a lot of people really like to play with that flavor and have an elvish sounding name for an elf.
Yeah, and the important thing to consider, there's not a best race in D&D. There's just choosing, what's going to be best for your play style, for the game you're playing, and who's in your party.
Every race is viable. Every race is good, especially the like original 9. There's not really one standout. A lot of races will do things better than other races, but that doesn't mean that the other race is incapable of doing that thing. So whereas like a tiefling is going to be a great warlock, but an elf could be a warlock also and be a great warlock.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of different approaches to choosing your race, and you highlighted one is sort of the min-maxing or metagaming approach. We know tieflings make great warlocks, not only because they have this sort of demonic presence about them, but they also get a boost to their charisma score. They get some really cool innate spells, and there's just a lot of flavor that connects the two. So if you're min-maxing or metagaming, that's totally fine. That's a very valid play style. But you can that approach requires looking at the stats and trying to match those to your class.
Yeah, and this I think is for a lot of us our first route that we choose to pick a class when you're kind of just getting started in the game. And I still do this, to be honest. To an extent, I want my character to be the best whatever. I don't want to play suboptimal characters. To me, that's kind of frustrating. So if I can get, we'll call it an advantage, even though they all start, with basically the same stats. But if I can get a little bit of an advantage having +2 to charisma, I'm going to take it. If I can get an advantage getting, playing a half-orc fighter and getting 2 to strength and 1 to con, like you're going to be the best fighter there is. You're going to be the best barbarian out there simply because your stat block is slightly better. But I'm still going to role play the heck out of these characters. So I do min-max a tiny bit. I metagame to an extent when creating characters, because usually I have the class that I want to play picked out first. Then I choose the race. I know that's not the way that the player's handbook is laid out, but that's the way that I normally build my characters.
Yeah, you have an idea in mind, and from there it's pretty easy to figure out like what stats you need, what race is going to then support those stats. And again, that can be a lot of fun. There's also some other things to consider outside of just the racial stat bonuses that each race gets.
Hmm.
Things like dark vision. We're playing
Yes.
a game called Dungeons and Dragons. There's going to be in
Yeah.
caves and in dungeons and in crypts and all of these places where
Hmm.
there might not be a lot of available light. And as a new player, I know it can be a little jarring with your fresh-faced, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed fighter going into a
Hmm.
dark cave. Oh, do you have a torch?
Yeah.
No, I'm a new player. I didn't think I needed a torch in this world. Can I use my
Yeah.
smartphone? Sorry, but now you're not able to hit anything because you don't have dark vision. So that's one mechanic that could be overlooked, but it's actually a very
Hmm.
very useful and a very important trait for dungeon delving explorers.
Yes, I think dark vision is the probably number one racial trait. It just gets so much utility. So a lot of classes have it, or a lot of races have it, like more than half maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I, so it's just so useful. And when you're used to having it, and you go to a class that doesn't, you feel handicapped a lot of times. You definitely miss it when you don't have it.
You certainly think about it a lot more, maybe take it
Yeah.
for granted. And so there are other useful abilities that different
Hmm.
races get. So some of them actually get innate spellcasting abilities. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but the forest gnomes, for example, can learn some minor illusion cantrips. The drow or dark elves learn,
Hmm.
spells that kind of reflect their lineage stemming in the Underdark.
Yeah, and these are cool additions to your kind of play style. They change a little bit. If you're playing a drow fighter, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of spells, but then you get these kind of innate spells. So you get this bonus that a human fighter or a dwarf fighter wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
So it changes the play style a little bit, which is really cool. I like mechanics that will alter a character from the beginning. I think that's really interesting. And if you can role play with those flavor, with those spells or dark vision or kind of whatever it is, it just breathes a lot more life into your characters.
Yeah, and I think really the best example of this is the Legend of Drizzt series,
Hmm.
where in the texts Salvatore actually goes into like when he actually casts the spells, so you can kind of get an understanding of how a drow would utilize these spells in an
Hmm.
actual adventure, which is really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's neat that those carried over to the game and you can use those for your Drizzt ripoff.
Yeah. Which we know everybody does at some point or another in their D&D career.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little later too, I think.
So again, you can kind of metagame this to where if I wanted to play an already stealthy character, I can add an extra level of stealth to it. Or if I already wanted these proficiencies, I can choose a race that grants them. Or you can just pick a race that you think is cool and get what comes with it.
If you're going the min-max route, it doesn't
Hmm.
mean you can't play an interesting character with a lot of depth or nuance. It doesn't have to be this just archetype. You can still put a really interesting flavor on it and make it your character, even though, of course, as you said before, like they are the best at, doing this profession.
Yeah, I think min-maxing and metagaming get a bad rap because of like the typical type of player that we think does this.
Yeah.
Again, I want my adventurers to be, if they're a fighter, I want them to be a good fighter. I want to hit when I roll, more often than not. I don't want to be naturally handicapped. I don't think that necessarily breeds a fun game
Yeah.
to have a subpar character for whatever reason. I think you can mix any class in any race and still have a good, well-rounded character in your class. You're going to hit. You're going to be able to role play. You're going to do all these things. But Dungeons and Dragons is a game of percentages,
Yeah.
and I want to up my percentage as much as possible because I want to have fun. And hitting is fun, and missing isn't.
So by relying on different racial abilities, not only can you elevate your overall, probability for success in a lot of areas, you're also
Mhm.
giving a lot more flavor and excitement in life and different approaches to how you would play your character. And that brings us to our next point is the other approach you can take aside from min-maxing these characters is building a character purely based on role playing. We talk about different ways to approach the character building process, and I think this one is probably our favorite.
Like I said, with choosing your race based on your class, and that's kind of what we all do in the beginning of our Dungeons and Dragons career. This, I think, is what a lot of us graduate to. I know the way that I build characters, I typically have a characteristic, a personality first, a character that I want to play, and then I figure out what class is this character. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one that makes the most sense. And then after that, okay, what race is this character? Race to me is kind of tertiary. It's the third thing I pick. Because they're all so even and they all have really cool things about them. It's not as important to me as knowing the character and then figuring out kind of where they would fit and what class. I think you've got this down if that character you've created could be any class and any race and still maintain its main characteristics.
Yes. And I think viewing it through that lens gives you the ability to start looking at the origins, the history, the backstory, thinking about the story that you want to tell with this character. Is their race a prominent feature in that?
Yeah, which it can be. It definitely can be. And a lot of really all of the races, but I would say the uncommon races, especially their background, the way that they've experienced the world from childhood until the beginning of adventuring is going to shape them a lot.
Yeah. And it's important to recognize that. And if you want to develop a rich role-playing experience, keeping that in mind and adopting a more empathetic view of your character and trying to understand, like, what was their history? What would it have been like for them to grow up in this world that, either views them in awe or fear or, just downright disrespect.
Yeah.
It's going to change their outlook on things. And the interesting story then to tell is, how does this character rise above this?
And that, I think, is interesting, just talking about like the entire scope of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Thinking of it like telling a story, your character should change.
Yeah.
Like they should overcome things. We are all our own antagonists and protagonists in Dungeons and Dragons because it's collaborative. Your character should have an arc. And that arc, it can just be achieving the goal that they set out to do. But oftentimes, if you have an interesting backstory with trauma or some sort of problem that you have to overcome, only achieving that goal and not changing anything else about the character sometimes falls flat. So there is a lot of interesting flavor that you can bring to that overarching story just with your race.
Yeah.
Just from the beginning. If you come from the dwarves but you didn't ever fit in, and there are all these things that you can add in and get your beginning of that arc from the race.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be the typical story. Like you said, a mountain-dwelling dwarf, who is the son of a prominent, trader, or the princess, to the king. Sure, that's one route, but there's so many other angles to slice it. Different origin stories and different hooks. And I think it's up to the DM as well to, as we go back, refer back to those episode 0 sessions, understand from a DM standpoint, when you better understand the characters, their origins, their history, and how their race plays into that, then you can also help bring those character development moments into the campaign. And one way to do that is just present those characters with very difficult choices.
Yeah, a good DM is going to bring any sort of conflict that is going to drive character development. And if you have made your race a part of your character, then it can be used to develop it.
Yes.
I spoke a few minutes ago about how if you have a good character, it could be any race, it could be any class. That's definitely true. And any one of these classes or any one of these races can be used for character development. But once you figure out which one you want to be, that's when you start to kind of drill in on it and figure out what about your halfling is different from other halflings. What about your human makes them want to go adventuring? And again, in your zero session, you talk about this with your table, with your DM, and hopefully they will be able to use that to guide your character down their path.
We talked about a lot of different things in terms of choosing a race. So let's go through the races in the player's handbook. So we can talk about what we choose, what we like to play, and how we role play them. The races are divided into two categories. Mm-hmm. You got common races, the ones that are most populous in the world, and you've got the uncommon races, starting with the dwarves. What you know about dwarves, Eric?
So dwarves, I feel like we have a really, as a player base, we have a good understanding of what dwarves are. Mostly, I would say, from Tolkien. Yeah. You've got Gimli, which is everybody's favorite dwarf. But even in The Hobbit, you've got a whole plethora of dwarves. So you really get a good cross-section of what a dwarven personality is. At least the stereotypical dwarven personality. And what I like about that is it makes dwarves easy to role play, because you can very easily play the stereotypical dwarf. Sturdy, stubborn, like full of heart, loyal, Scottish accent. You can very easily play those and play a very good dwarf. But knowing what the base is, knowing what the typical dwarf is, it's also, I feel like, easy to play against type and be something different. So I feel like dwarves are very easy to role play, both sides, the typical and the atypical dwarf.
But I have trouble with dwarves particularly, because in my mind they're so solidified as in terms of their archetype, that a lot of times it's difficult for me to go too far from the norm. Like I can see dwarven rangers and clerics and things of that nature. But when I start thinking about dwarven wizards, I'm just like, it's a lot. Even when I'm trying to imaginate things, I'm stretching my brain a little bit here.
But I feel like that, because the typical dwarf, it's usually have a distrust for magic, except for like clerical magic. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good beginning, though. If you're a dwarf from adolescence, always wanted to be a wizard, but they're the only one in their clan that is interested in it. So that's maybe why they had to leave to go learn. And they want to prove to their parents that this is their career choice was worthy. Like, that is a good starting point for an adventure.
So what kind of dwarf would you play if you were going to role play a dwarf in a campaign?
So I'm going to be honest. Dwarves are one of my least favorite races. I just don't identify with them. I don't know why. I do think that they're pretty typical, and I tend to shy away from that. I'm gonna contradict myself later on when we get to my favorite race. But I think having that natural aversion to dwarves, I would go in with a dwarven fighter. Again, I don't have a very good Scottish accent, but it's fun to try. You get to be kind of bold and brash and daring as a dwarf. They don't have a lot of fear. They charge into things, and you get to play just a really big hero in a small package as a dwarf. Again, I think they can be any class. They naturally fit into a few better than others. I don't care about that a lot of times. I would put them, if I wanted to play a hero like that, because again, I start with the character. If I wanted to play a brash, bold, friendly hero, I would probably pick a dwarf and then figure out what class they are after that. So that's the way I would play them, I think. So next up we have elves. Chris, what do you know about elves?
Elves are interesting because there's such a wide variety, even amongst such an elegant and graceful race. Mm-hmm. They're typically long living, just like the dwarves. Dwarves live about 400 years. Elves, 700 years is kind of the norm.
Yeah.
So there's a certain level of detachment and way of observing the world, and they're not so hasty with their words or actions. But you have three species of elves. Mm-hmm. All of them are lean, lithe, slightly shorter than humans, The high elves, who are very attuned to magic, are also kind of they're the haughty elves, the ones you
Yeah.
think of like the snotty, snooty, better than thou elves. You have their crunchier cousin, the wood elves, who are a lot more grounded. They're a
Hmm.
lot more friendly toward other races. You would see them mingling amidst them a little more readily. And then you also have the dark elves or the drow, who are also typically they've been villainized and demonized as an evil race
Hmm.
because they live in the Underdark. They were driven underground. They have a pact with Lolth, and which have twisted them and turned them into an evil culture. And so there's such a huge range amidst elves that it makes a very interesting race to choose from.
And similar to, I mean, I think we're going to see a through line through every one of these races. You can play to those stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
If you want something to be kind of prim and proper and posh, you can play a high elf. Like that fits really well.
Especially for wizards, scholarly
Hmm.
classes, because high elves are deemed more intelligent. They certainly would be happy to let anybody of an inferior race know that.
Yes. But again, I feel like if you knowing the box that the elves fit in, especially each sub race, like you just laid out, the high elves are kind of prim and proper. You can easily break that mold
Mm-hmm.
and have somebody who's not, and maybe that's why they don't fit into their society all that well, or that's part of their struggle. It builds in more for your character to do, or more reason for your character to adventure, rather than their cookie cutter elf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you look at, for example, the high elves, and they have these certain personality traits that socially we might say like, okay, those aren't like the most desirable traits. Like
Hmm.
you're arrogant, you're overconfident, whatever. There's also a way to look at those traits if you really want to play like high fantasy, or you do want to play the typical iconoclast high elf.
Hmm.
You know, you got to look at it from like the whole group of the party.
Yeah.
Is your character just a jerk? How is that helpful? But if you do want to role
Yes.
play some of these personalities, there is a way to take some of those personalities, maybe tone them down a little bit, and make them maybe endearing
Hmm.
in certain ways. I remember, playing a table where there was an edgelord type character that was like servant of the Raven Queen and had this
Yeah.
crazy dark past warlock edgelord,
Yeah.
I thought it was an interesting character. I was playing a druid, Furbolg, who has a very also detached, kind of almost elvish
Hmm.
view of the world. And so while this person was obsessed with death and murder and decay, that was a part of the evolution of life. So I was able to kind of work with that player and bring that into the story and feed off of that. Looking at those ways, if you want to be an edgelord, if you want to play a certain personality type, working with your party to make that, whether it's from a racial or a personality source, to make that not something that's going to add value to the game
Yeah.
and not grate and wear on the other players.
Yeah. I would be remiss if we talked about the drow without talking about that specific trope.
Yeah.
For me, almost any table I've sat at where somebody comes with their character and I see their race and it's drow, I almost immediately roll my eyes. And because typically this person is going to be on the more edge, this character is going to be on the more edge lord side of that sliding scale. And I typically like, like you just talked about, characters that want to be in the party and want to help the party and make the game run smoothly, rather than characters that are typically kind of selfish, brooding, and don't help the game run smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Drow, I feel like people will fall into the trap because they are a traditionally evil race, quote unquote evil race. And a lot of the mythos we have about them is that they are evil and brooding and edgelords. So it's easy to play that, similar to we talked about with the high elves and with the dwarves. It's easy to play in that box.
Mm-hmm.
I find it players don't often break that mold when it comes to drow. So if you want to play a drow, to be honest, they might be my very least favorite race. I don't see why you would want to. The sunlight sensitivity in by itself would drive me away from that race like completely, unless you're playing a full Underdark campaign. I would never play them. But if you want to play that race, I would recommend thinking outside the box. Don't make a traditional evil drow, because it is going to grate on your party members, and it's going to be very hard for you to add value.
Mm-hmm. Unless you're playing an evil campaign, then you're making an appropriate choice.
Yeah. Even then, though, evil campaigns, like, cool, be a drow, be an evil drow. Why are you guys on a team? You know, that for me is a central question when I create characters every single time. Why is this person in a party of adventurers? Why aren't they a farmer? Why aren't they at home selling their wares? Why aren't they solo in the wilderness? So, like, what bonds me to my group? And a lot of times, like, the chaotic or the evil alignments, it's hard to answer that question. And a lot of players, when they choose a drow, want to choose those alignments because that fits. Chaotic evil drow, that makes perfect sense. It just makes it very hard to play in a party.
Yeah, you got to ask yourself: Does this character belong? And would the party even keep this character in their group if they were behaving in such a way? So with drow, I think it's also from a DMing standpoint. Mm-hmm. The drow are typically vilified in the world of D&D. So if because they live in the Underdark. If there's one out in the world walking around, one can only assume that they're up to no good. There is, of course, the exception of Dritz. So when you're creating your character, also try not to just create a Dritz knockoff that's too easy to do and a little too on the nose. There's nuances there. But as a DM, like, personally, my style, I'm not going to persecute a player for choosing a drow. Mm-hmm. So when they go into the world, it's hard for me just as a person to basically like start enacting racism on a character.
Yeah,
I don't want to do that. And kind of like what we talked about before, these some of these races that are typically aligned as evil, that's starting to change. Over the summer, with the very unfortunate murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, in response to that, Wizards, has started to go back through the lore and retcon those problematic, reductive, and racist, representations of certain characters, the drow included.
Yeah. So
for me, that I'm very happy. I think that's a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But the only way this really takes any kind of hold is if we, as a community, as players and DMs, choose to represent these characters differently. And a lot of that can start from just judging characters by their actions, not by what plane of hell they're from or the color of their skin or anything else.
The games that we've played, I typically play humans, but I've played some monstrous races, even goblins. And that's typically the way that we play. I'm not going to be barred service at an inn because my race is goblin, but I would be barred service from that inn if I come in and I'm acting like a jerk, or if I'm stealing things, different. So I find that is a much better way to play the game.
Yeah. So there's a default mode that the game can be set on, and you just gotta take that dial and just turn it from racist to inclusive.
Yes. And you can still have, because we're still in the common races. Drow are the least common on the surface. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the uncommon races, you can still treat them as maybe a novelty, a different, whoa, I've never seen a Dragonborn before. But it's, you just have to turn that on its head a little bit to where it's not just outright prejudice.
Very good point. Let's move on to our halfling friends.
So, Chris, halflings are your favorite race, am I correct?
They make me so happy.
Tell me a little bit about halflings.
I mean, you can't be a fan of these games and Tolkien and just the fantasy world without having some love in your heart for halflings, hobbitses, whatever you want to refer to them as.
Yeah.
Halflings are fun because they really bring or have the opportunity to bring a lot of joy and levity to the game. And I think in a world where you're exploring dark and dangerous places, you're fighting monsters, and you're facing death on a daily basis, you kind of need that levity.
Yeah.
So aside from their gregarious personality, their love for good pipeweed, wine, and food, halflings are really fun because they make such expert rogues. Their mechanics in hiding and being stealthy are really almost second to none. So they're a lot of fun in that regard. But that doesn't mean you can't turn that typecast on its head. They also make incredibly fun fighters. I think they can make fun bards as well. And there's just a lot of room for role playing. And then, of course, you can't really talk about halflings without talking about how lucky they are. So if you roll a 1 while you're playing a halfling, you get the ability to re-roll that. And we don't want to roll 1s. That's not our goal in life. So being able to re-roll that and take that next number can be it can be the difference between life and death, success and failure.
That is, halflings are such a fun race, and they are one that, if I have a character that you mentioned is jovial and maybe a prankster and a jokester and is really just optimistic, it's going to be hard for me to pick a different race than a halfling.
I mean, that's my personality type generally.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really easy to become a halfling. I'm also 6'3", and I have this weird affinity for just little, smaller races in all the games that I play. I don't know why, but it's so much fun to see the world through a halfling's eyes. And that brings us to the last of the common races and your personal favorite, humans.
Yes, humans, I said earlier that I didn't like dwarves because I thought they were kind of basic and that I would contradict myself later. Humans are my favorite race. They are the most prevalent race in the world of Dungeons and Dragons and the most basic. But with that basicness comes versatility. And on the scale of role-playing, humans are super easy to role-play. We are humans. So any personality you can come up with will fit in this race. Any fictional character you've ever seen that you want to copy and add into your character creation pot of stew can easily be a human. I personally, on the metagaming side of it, love humans because of the human variant. So humans traditionally get a +1 to all attributes, which is good. It's fine. But if you take the variant, you get a feat. And starting the game off with a feat it's game changing. It can completely change the way that I play my character. And a lot of times thinking of what would my character do? What is their backstory? How do they grow up? Those kind of things. I will find a feat that kind of fits that story. And that it's a mechanical way in the game to represent a part of this person's personality that just makes it easier to play as them.
So you say that you kind of jump in feet first.
Oh, I would jump in both feet first if you gave me 2. I'm also stingy later in game. I want to add to my attributes. I don't want to trade those for feats later on. Even though sometimes, depending on the build you build, it might be more worth it to do that. I'm just kind of stingy in that way. I want, I want to max my main attribute first. So getting a feat early on is just so much fun. And there's so many different ones. And you don't even necessarily have to be one of, the S tier feats in order for it to make the character feel different and more fun and engaging.
Yeah. So with these feats, and we'll talk at length about feats in a later video, but they add a really unique trait or spin to your character. So when you're developing your character, if you jump in feet first and choose your feet and build a character from that, that's totally fine and valid, and that's so fun to do as well, to try out those mechanics. But if you're choosing a feat as a level 1 human, it's really cool to bring that into your character's story and leverage that if it's something that you're going to be really using in the game. Like it adds so much more flavor and depth instead of just being a mechanical thing that you chose for your character because it's cool or it's going to help you wreck things early on. Because it will.
Yeah.
Be awesome in doing that and tell a great story.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we'll talk about feats later, but there are so many different examples that kind of easily add your backstory. Polearm master. Who taught you how to be a polearm master? Where did you learn this? Because most human fighters are using axes and swords. Why are you using a polearm? Is that part of your culture? Is that part of just your family? There's a lot of interesting backstory elements you can get just from picking a feat.
So those are all the common races. Let's talk about the uncommon races. These are the ones that are going to definitely get a second glance if they walk into a bar or tavern. Starting with the regal and proud Dragonborn.
Out of all of the races, we've talked about which one's my favorite. I think the Dragonborn are the coolest.
Easily the
They
coolest.
easily the coolest. They're 6 to 7 feet tall, 300 pounds, human-sized dragons. They just demand respect when they just by standing there. They're super super cool. They have a long proud history. They're proud people, but not arrogant. The way that elves can tend to be. They have breath weapon, which is really cool and can add a lot of flavor to your fighting situations. They have extra charisma, so you can be the face of the party, you can intimidate, you can charm. They're such a cool race.
And it's neat because their breath weapon and their resistances come from their chromatic heritage, which can be traced back to the chromatic dragons. So when you're creating a Dragonborn, when I first made a Dragonborn Paladin, which was a ton of fun to play, looking at, okay, well, I want to play, a cool champion of Bahamut, and you shoot lightning out of my breath.
Yeah.
You can kind of build that into your story. Why is this, lightning dragon? Like, where did that come from? And really add some flavor and life to your Dragonborn, because you'd be doing them a disservice if you don't, flesh some of that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, Dragonborn are interesting because, like you said, they come in every color of that a dragon will come in, and those different colors grant different breath weapons and different resistances. Yeah. So a red Dragonborn will breathe fire and have resistance to fire, which is it's just it's another mechanic in the game that you can use to character build. If you're a red Dragonborn, do you come from a land that is moltenness? Like, are you from the base of a volcano because you're resistant to fire, so it doesn't bother you there? There's just a lot of like interesting things you can do with something so simple as a resistance.
Yeah, and so when playing these characters, playing Dragonborn, I typically go for a little more quiet, reserved, but authoritative.
Yeah,
someone who only needs to throw their weight around when they really need to. So I usually view them as a leader type character. Just understanding their presence, the mechanical sort of having the extra charisma. That's how I usually role play these characters.
Yeah, Dragonborn make great leaders. They make great paladins, and paladins are oftentimes kind of a natural leader of a good aligned party anyway. So if that's the type of character you want to play, that's the type of role player you are or want to be, this is a great race to start with.
Yeah, I personally shy away from like these more exotic races a lot of the times, but Dragonborn are just so cool. I definitely make an exception for them.
All right, next up we have gnomes. Now, gnomes are what I would consider kind of the cousins of halflings. I don't know if canonically they are, but they're very similar. So a lot of times I like to highlight the difference between the two races, where I think of halflings as kind of city folk. They're merchants, they're bakers, they're in the tavern. Gnomes, I tend to think of them as more country folk. They're living in the forest, they're living under the hills, they're out in the wilds, and that. You want to bring that into the character creation. You want to bring that into your personality. Are you nervous around groups of people? Do you not like cities? Simple things like that can be, flaws brought into your character sheet simply from your race. My race is from the woods. I don't like going in caves. Whatever it is. I like gnomes. They're fun. They are, again, very similar to halflings. So they're jovial. They're pranksters. They may not be as gluttonous as a halfling is, for food and wine, but they are gluttonous in so far as they are always seeking information. They're tinkerers. They want to know how things work. If you let a gnome in your house, they're definitely going to take apart your grandfather clock and maybe not be able to put it back together. So they're a very interesting race.
Gnome is actually one that I've not played nor have been particularly interested in. I usually just go for halfling.
Yeah.
But imagine gnomes also being, at least the representation, the classical representation of gnomes. They are very energetic. They're very, they talk very fast. They just are very excitable, and they just get so curious, and they just want to get in everything. So that's, if I were to play a gnome, I think maybe that would be that curiosity or that excitability is something I would bring into my character.
Yeah, gnomes, again, they're very similar to halflings. So if you have a character that could be either, you're going to want to go in and maybe look at some of the differences. What do you want to focus on? Do you like sitting around a table and sharing a beer, or do you want to maybe be a tinkerer and make little things for your party? They're very similar. I like gnomes. I to be honest, might like gnomes more than I like halflings. If you're interested in a character that could be either, and you want to metagame it a little bit, or do you want to be an intelligence-based character or a dex-based character? And that could easily make that decision for you, because gnomes get +2 to intel, and they get dark vision, and they get a lot of the things. I don't believe halflings have dark vision.
No, they do not.
So if you want to play a halfling who's smarter and can see in the dark, play a gnome.
There you go. All right, that takes us next into half-elves. And half-elves are another one of my personal favorites. This is because I typically like to play bard, and there's not really a class that's much better at being a bard than the half-elf.
Yeah.
And they have kind of an interesting history behind them as well, kind of having a foot in both worlds. And typically in this fantasy setting, that's attributed to some salacious encounters, and they're not reviled by any means.
Yeah.
But they're certainly maybe a source of some rumors and gossip. And because of that, they make great diplomats. They do have a boost in charisma, but they also get additional bonuses to 2 stats that you get to choose. So in that sense, they can also become very versatile. And it's that versatility that I really enjoy about the half-elves. And they're also easy to roleplay.
Yeah.
So I typically just adopt the general human persona that I would take. If I'm playing a bard, of course, I just kind of try and dial it up to 11.
Yeah.
And really, you got to put yourself out there. Generally with these charismatic races, you're typically going to be role-playing a lot more.
Yes.
So that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're selecting these races. Some of them lend themselves more to really in-depth role-playing than maybe others do.
Yeah, so the half-elf is interesting because it's half human, half elf. So you're getting kind of the best of both worlds. For a beginner, my advice would be it's very similar to the gnome. If you want to play a human who's charismatic and can see in the dark, play a half-elf.
Yeah, having that extra dark vision and the Fey ancestry, to prevent sleep and getting an advantage against magical charm. Those are just one elevation that or resistance or bonus that they get over humans, while still getting some of the cool benefits, sans feat that the humans do.
And it's easy for me to like I said, I always ask the question, why is this person an adventurer? It's easy for me to answer that question with a half-elf. They've got a foot in 2 different worlds, and they're not exactly accepted in either. They're not accepted fully in either elven or human culture. So, like you said, they'd be great diplomats. They're great traders. They're moving between worlds. Maybe they're out looking for something. Those things of why you don't have a typical 9 to 5, that's easier for me to answer with a half-elf.
Yeah, the hook is readily accessible.
So up next, we have the half-orc. This race is a powerhouse. If you want to be intimidating and strong and unrivaled in battle, this is the race to choose.
Yeah, I mean they're perfectly built for it.
Yes.
So half orcs are really interesting, and I really want to talk about this as a race. I think it is also one of the other ones that I've not yet been able to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a character in mind that I would like to bring in for this. They suffer a similar fate as the drow in terms of usually being vilified or shunned because of their orcish lineage. But I think there's some really interesting ways you can take that, and they're also, half orcs are suited for barbarian and fighter, like first choice.
Yes.
But let's talk about ways to subvert that, or maybe play against those types, or embrace those types and take a unique spin on them.
Yeah.
So how would you go about playing a half orc character?
So half orcs, I have played a little bit, and similar to a lot of the other races, I feel like we have the kind of box that they could fit in: dumb, brooding, like strong, quick to anger. And a lot of times, for the first time I play a class or play a race, I tend to stay in that box a little bit. And then the more times you get to play it, you don't want to play the same thing twice. So you change it up. If I were wanting to play a half orc, I may stick in that box a little bit. I would look at characters that I enjoy that maybe are a little brunt, maybe are strong. One that comes to mind would be the Hound from Game of Thrones. Now, he is brash and strong and quick to anger and quick to violence, but he has so many other traits under that kind of caused that. And we get to see in the books and in the show his arc and in dealing with his inner demons, and becoming a better person. I would maybe focus on something like that for this character.
I really like that approach because you have the opportunity to add so much layers and depth to that character instead of just being a typical blood fury, half orc marauder.
Like you said, half orcs really lend themselves to barbarian specifically, but fighter also. They have 2 to strength, 1 to constitution. Barbarian is a class that I've never super been interested in because of that. The stereotypical barbarian is an 8 intel and not very charismatic and quick to anger, and those aren't the stats that I like to dump when I play this game. I typically want a charismatic person. I typically want to be on the smarter side because I like to try to figure out ways to solve conflict that's not necessarily always violence. So this usually isn't going to be the first class or race that I pick. Yeah. But if I do, I want something different. Metagaming, again, I am gonna play them as a fighter or a barbarian. They just make such good fighters or barbarians. The racial traits lend so well to martial classes, strength-based martial classes. But if you're gonna play off the wall and be a bard or be a wizard for the same kind of reasons we talked about earlier, like I've always wanted to be a wizard, but I'm strong as heck. I can't help it. Kind of like the bumbling oaf of a wizard. That's interesting. It's easier to when you have something that is so stereotypical to then just do the opposite also, and you have 2 really easy ways to play a race.
Yeah, you have to be careful not to get too gimmicky with that. Just doing the opposite. Yeah. Try and bring something actually interesting to the forefront of the character. And with the metagaming approach, and if that's the style you want to play, awesome, go for it. You're gonna blast doing that. Just know that there's going to be other situations in the game where murdering things is not going to be what's happening, and your character's going to have something else to do. Yeah. And if they don't, because you've been min-maxed just for that one thing, you might not have as much enjoyment at the table or be involved with the story as the other players. And that might be okay for you, but it's something to consider and think about when you're choosing your race, especially one that's so tied to a specific class.
Yeah. And not even just the class, like specifically dealing damage. I find that a majority of the campaign isn't combat. I wouldn't even, I don't know if it's even, if combat's even 40% of an entire campaign. So if you're completely optimized for 30%, 20%, 10% of a campaign, the rest of that time you're just twiddling your thumbs. No one wants you to do charisma checks. No one wants you to, be the person who goes and talks to the bartender. You're not stealthy. That is, it's hard for me to deal with seeing kind of like the full arc of a campaign, which is probably also a reason I tend to stay away from barbarians, and I tend to stay away from half orcs in general. If I were to play a half orc fighter or barbarian, you've got your strength, you've got your constitution, everything else I would pump into charisma, because that's typically the way that I play. I want to talk. I want to role play, and it's hard to role play if your character is dumb and not charismatic. You just don't get to take part in a lot of what I consider to be the fun of the game.
Yeah, and in some cases, maybe you could even hinder the game, or
yeah,
cause some things to happen that you didn't intend to.
Yeah. If you're failing charisma checks because you're trying to chat up somebody, and then you get thrown out of an inn or of a shop, you've walled off a potential lead or solution for your team, and that hurts. That sucks to happen.
And last of the uncommon races are tieflings. Tieflings are unique because their race is a direct result of a bloodline pact struck with Lord Asmodeus of the Nine Hells. And this forever, twists their lineage. So 1,000 years ago, if your, great 10 times removed Uncle Frank made a deal with the devil, like, okay, well, now we're all tieflings, and that's just our lot in life. And because of that dark demonic deal, of course, they're typically reviled in the world. They're not easily accepted. Again, we play in a world where we judge characters by their actions. Tieflings are interesting because they just look like monsters. But they do offer, some very interesting racial bonuses. They make great warlocks.
Yes.
We mentioned before they have this deal with the devil, and it just lent their visage, their look, their history, their lore just really lends itself perfectly, just like a half orc to a barbarian.
Yeah.
That the warlock to the tiefling is a match made in hell.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the uncommon races they feel kind of tailor made for specific classes.
Mm-hmm.
Dragonborn with a paladin, gnomes with, I would say, wizard, half elves with a bard, half orcs with a barbarian, and tieflings with a warlock. If you know kind of what class you want to play, it can make picking race easier if you want to metagame, especially through the uncommon races. There's a pretty obvious choice for a lot of these. I find that tieflings fall into the same trap that drow fall into, in that a lot of tieflings at tables are brooding loners, which can very easily make sense because of their background. Again, they look like demons, they look like devils, they are outcasts a lot of times. That's going to breed a lot of introverted characteristics, but that doesn't make the game any more fun for the whole team. I would argue it doesn't make the game more fun for that player. So it's hard. It's very easy, I guess, to fall into that trap, and it's hard for players to think outside the box on tieflings. I think tieflings are on the harder end of the role-playing spectrum, because whereas like we kind of know what a half orc is like generally, you can either play to type or you can play against type, or find common ground in between. I don't know what a tiefling's like. I don't have a lot of representation of tieflings in other media to where I can pull like, oh, okay, I know what dwarves are like because I've seen the Lord of the Rings series. They're hard to kind of figure out what makes them tick. They're easy to be warlocks, but they're hard to role play.
So how would you go about it then? What approaches would you take? How would you develop a tiefling's personality and bring that into the game?
I tend to, we've talked about ad nauseum, develop my personalities first and then kind of see what fits or what's fun or whatever after. I have played a tiefling before, and the tiefling I played was a warlock, obviously, um, and he was a gambler. So he was a little embarrassed that he was a tiefling because he traded his humanity away for power, basically. So he tried to hide it, and I played him as somebody with like some shame and a secret. Um, he was on lighter skin tiefling with small horns, so it was kind of easier for him to blend in with a disguise kit.
Yeah.
Um, I played him as a human with a secret, a human with some shame, and I thought that added a. He wasn't brooding. He wasn't a loner. He still was in the party. We were in the inn, he wanted to play cards and try to win some money. And throughout the game, he his secret was revealed, and he had to become comfortable with like who he was now. And I thought that was really good character development for a character. Um, but I would stray away from what we know as the archetype for the tiefling. And it's our usual advice of be a team player, not a solo player. Uh, don't be brooding. You could be maybe a little brooding. It just makes it hard to play when somebody is trying to play a solo game, and I feel like tieflings oftentimes bring that out in players.
Yeah, you can brood. You can
Yeah.
also brood in a way that can also try and bring some levity with your brooding,
Yeah.
or make it like bring it into the game in a way that can add some flavor or fun. If it's just I'm brooding all the time because I'm mad,
Yeah.
that's not very interesting. But if there's reasons behind that, try and figure out the motivations.
Yeah.
And if there's a way to bring those motivations into the actions and into what your character is saying, that's good role playing. That's good character
Yes.
development, and that's embodying your character. And that even if a character is brooding, if I understand what things are tormenting your character, my character is empathetic.
Yeah.
Hey friend, what weighs so heavily on your mind? What can I learn from your character in the game? This is why I love it. All right, we're gonna get deep into this. This is where the magic of these games happen. When your character in the game is suffering, and they're suffering because of things they've experienced, that's a cue for me as a player to then like, okay, well, I want to learn more about your character. It's not just about my character and what they're doing and getting my experience points. I want to know what rich story have you created. Let's pull that out in the game and let's grow together. Every time that's happened in our games, the group becomes tighter. The role playing, the game, everything just becomes so much more. You just become so much more invested in the story that's happening. And then you actually do see growth. It's so much fun.
That level of role playing it might be natural for some new players, but it took us a while. It took me a while to get to that. So I feel like newer players, if they're playing a tiefling and they pick the brooding archetype, when one of their teammates asks them what's wrong, nothing, leave me alone. That you deflated all the air out of the situation. So if you find yourself on that spectrum, figure out what does your character need to open up? What does your character need to start working through these demons? If your team goes into an inn and the bard wants to play a song and the paladin wants to talk to the bartender to find information and the rogue wants to play a game of cards and you want to sit in the corner and sulk, you're not adding to the team. You're not adding to finding the information that you need. You're not adding to building relationships. If you find yourself in those holes, figure out what your character needs to dig out of them. And a lot of times it might be a complete character reshape. The brooding archetype is so hard sometimes to get away from because it by nature locks you alone. Sometimes you have to just be like, you know what? Can we talk about this? I don't think this is working. Maybe my guy now is a prankster, or whatever. Yeah. So that is something I would give warning to, because tieflings are really cool. Not only their ability scores, again, they have dark vision. They have hellish resistance, so they're resistant to fire. They have a lot of cool flavor they can bring in that's not mechanical. I've just seen far too many players fall into the trap.
Yeah, you have to be able to invite people in and allow role-playing opportunities to happen. Okay, folks, that's it for today's episode on choosing your race. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and click that notification bell. It updates you on new episodes and goes a long way in supporting the show.
You can also listen to a podcast version of this show on all major podcast networks. Subscribe to the newsletter and get new content and exclusive bonuses delivered straight to your inbox. Never spam.
And stay tuned for the next part of our ongoing character creation series where we talk about choosing your class. Thanks for watching.
And we'll catch you next time.